Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited to look where our conversation is going to take us. Just before to introduce our topic, I want to say, please feel free to participate as much as possible. Use the chat box. Any questions that they come up, we'll take them as it goes, of course. And then we will have 20 minutes at the end. We will talk a little bit, 20 minutes between me and Bryan. We'll have 20 minutes at the end for Q&A specifically, but we want to make it as interactive as possible. So ask questions, use the chat, and we will make sure to answer as many as we can questions. Our topic today is how to capitalize on agile potential, and it came up between our conversation with Bryan. What is the most important piece that we want to leave you with that you can go out, and it doesn't matter if you're with Scrum background, if you're Agile consultant or a coach without any technical background, you can have more strengthen your muscles and go and implement things based on a real life experience, which Bryan has plenty of in his journey implementing agile approaches in Scrum and Kanban, everything around how to stick and how to make this process successful in organizations such as Warner Media. So we will focus around what are the best approaches, what are the most successful practices, what are the commonality cross industries that people face, challenges and potential tips that they help them go through challenges when they work with Agile. And before we kick off with the real conversation and lead you through how Bryan started Agile and Warner Media and CNN, I just want to comment on why I am passionate about the process. And of course, Bryan could add his perspective and what makes him excited about and call himself an Agile evangelist. For me, particularly as a team coach, I see that the most important piece is to adjust your process based on the needs of your clients and the teams that you work with. If you go with the agenda that you have, most likely by the end, there will be a lot of missing pieces that you could have make it better and you could have adjusted if you constantly look for feedback from the participation from all the stakeholders. And I've seen this approach works over and over again. And I'm a Scrum Master myself, but I just use Scrum in the team coaching engagements, not pure Scrum Master. So that's from me. Bryan, what is your 2 cents on why do you believe in Agile process?
Because it brings stability. I mean, that's the quickest answer that I can possibly give about Agile is it brings stability to incredibly dynamic teams and dynamic environments. I grew up at Warner Media when it was still Turner Broadcasting. I started there about 21 years ago. Actually just past 21 years ago. And I started as an editor and as a photographer when I came over here, and I was just in my 20s and still trying to figure out what I was going to do when I grow up. And through my time in the field as a photographer and as an editor and as a journalist, and then switching over to the technology side, that experience is and as dynamic as as that environment has been, news is kind of like the worst case scenario for dynamic environments. You never know what's going to happen at any given moment, right? And so that kind of trained me to have to think about it in those terms, that Agile and what we were doing at CNN fit really well together, because of how just it's a scrappy mentality. I mean, that's the best way I can put it. And we've had some of our stakeholders who said that, and that's one of the reasons why it has succeeded there, is because there is a scrappy mentality. And I think that's just the scrappy mentality is just natural to that environment. And so for me personally, why I'm passionate about it is because having grown up in that environment, I used to keep saying growing up. I mean, that's kind of what I was doing I grew up there in my adulthood, I guess. And I'm passionate about it because stability is so important and so key. And you can have stability in crazy situations. And we've got those over and over and over again at CNN. And before Agile was brought in, it wasn't stable, right? There was a lot of, it was waterfall, let's face it. I mean, we started so long ago that we were still waterfall, and we switched over to Agile. And what Agile did is Agile brought stability. I'm going to say that word over and over again. It's starting to lose its meaning and sound a little bit.
That makes sense to me. But when you refer to stability, what do you actually mean? How Agile, when it's so flexible and you constantly adjust, how this uncertainty environment, how you can have this sense of stability that you're saying that Agile process brings?
Well, I mean, to bring that stability, you've got to jump into it whole hog. You've got to say, if you're going to be Agile, you're going to be Agile through thick or thin, and you've got to be willing to get through all of the early bumps and bruises that you're going to absolutely get when you're trying to adopt a new process. You're going to get those bumps and bruises, and getting through those initial, like the adolescence of it, I think that when you get to that point, you see the stability come into play, and the stability is reflected in teams having less thrashing, less context shifting. There's more focus, right? You start seeing releases happen on a more frequent basis. You start seeing quality go up. You start seeing issues go down, right? Because that's what the stability of the process brings. But when you first start it, you're not going to be there. I mean, it's just not going to happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What everybody else thinks, what makes you like Agile and use, if you are one of those on the code that use Agile, what is your why in believing in this process? Tap if you want your answers in the chat box. We'll move forward with the conversation and then come back and capture a few main points if you write some in the comments. So tell us about how currently you are using in Warner Media.
So we break it down. I break it down into two different camps. You've got the operationally focused teams, which are a lot of our broadcast engineering teams, and even some of our more engineering focused development teams. We typically push those teams to be a bit more Kanban, right? Because they can't commit to that 2-week sprint, things like that. We can break that up. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then we do Scrum for everything else. And we started with Scrum, but over time, it was obvious that some of these teams that are very operationally focused, some of these teams, couldn't commit to that 2-week iteration as much as we wanted to, and as much as we wanted to, like, well, it says it in the book, should be able to do this. We can't do that. And so for us, we had to adjust the process to fit our needs. And that's, I think, what is one of the big issues, or one of the things that everybody needs to remember, is that Agile is going to fit to your organization, right? You can't take it and just implement it as is by the book. It's just not going to happen. You're going to pick things that work. You're going to pick things that don't work, and that's okay.
That's an important point to make. So it's not like one cut thing that you just take it and you put it and it works the same everywhere. You adjust it, you know the main steps, the main points, and then you all agree with your team, with teams of teams, with the leadership, etc., and make it, customize it to your particular needs in your organization.
Well, even within our organization, we have some teams that are focused on such different areas that they have to even be able to take it further and customize it to themselves. And this is a part of that self-organizing that we kind of let happen. We still have guardrails up in terms of, the organization leadership, right? There's still certain things that, we have to, we say that are that we set, like the 2-week iteration, some of the tools and things like that we use, but we want the teams to organize around themselves. I see there's a few comments in the chat. Empathy, yes, that is a huge one. Thanks, Ross. Empathy in Agile is enormous. I mean, how can you build for the people that you're building for without really understanding them, or at least understanding a little bit of their pain? Easier to respond to the customer, easier to evolve. Yes, absolutely. Enjoy the incremental development. Yep. I mean, all of these small bets, experiments, adaptability. I mean, every single one of those things is spot on in terms of why Agile is successful and why it is that we keep coming back to it.
Yeah. And is Agile used only in groups for development, or there are other types of groups that you use Agile?
Right, so that's what so this is where I can go into a bit more detail on that. So our operationally focused teams, I mean, CNN's you got to imagine, if I'm going to use a metaphor, right? CNN is this big, giant Airbus plane just flying through the sky at 600 knots at 35,000 feet, right? It's not going to land. It can't land. It can't stop that operation in order to get some updates or get some features or whatever, this and that. And so we have a lot of teams that are very operationally focused, that are and the focus is making sure that we're responsive to the business, we're updating the system that we need to update. While they're doing it, trundling along as fast as we're, as chaotic as we're going. And so those teams that are focused on just keeping the plane flying, we have them using the Kanban process, and we're actually spreading it a bit more in the organization too. We're currently in the process of introducing more teams, and I've also got developing a simple onboarding process for these teams with Jira and Kanban too. But those teams that can't commit to that 2-week sprint because they are engineering focused, then we throw in the Kanban world. We're not masters at it. We're still kind of getting used to it. But just the idea, and what I'm doing with the teams is I'm helping them focus on the WIP limit. And this isn't, I mean, each of those teams that I've talked to right now, and I've asked them, well, yeah, how many things you got in progress? Oh, 70, 80 things. Well, that's baloney, that's not true. Nobody's working on 70, 80 things that entire time. And so with the Kanban process, one of the things that is really, I think, key, and that we're going to hammer home, and even up to leadership, is that WIP limit, and forcing that WIP limit into place to keep the teams from thrashing, and to improve the throughput. On the Scrum side, that's where we focus our development teams, our more product focused teams, where we have milestones that are off in the future, right? And it's just your typical kind of Scrum project, and we follow all the ceremonies, 2-week iteration. We have product owners embedded with the team. Okay, now I think I'm just starting to go on a rant. So yeah, and setting the WIP limit is such a challenge. Yeah, I agree. I mean, do you guys have any thoughts you want to throw in the chat on how to do that? I think that would be.
That would be great. Yes, very helpful.
But there's so much pressure. There's so much pressure on the teams to get it done and to do more. But and this is where the hard part is, because setting the WIP limit, and where the hard part is getting over that initial hump of adoption, right? Because you set that WIP limit, you got 5 stories that are in progress. And then you got, 2 engineers that are free because of that WIP limit. I mean, what I've been telling teams is, well, you get all those other, those two guys or two developers on those other projects or with those other team members and do some pair programming, and that way you can get them up to speed on what everybody's doing. So eventually everybody knows how to do everything, and then you got that, then Kanban starts to really improve. But yeah, that with limit,
yeah, regular retrospectives that aid in improving the process.
Yeah,
absolutely. So we have about 3 more minutes of our talk between us, and then we hope more people jump and ask more questions, and we make it more conversational with everybody else, not only me and you. But like big piece of making Agile works is a leadership, and I wanted to ask you for some insights of how did you sell it, how you involved all the stakeholders, what is the magic there?
I'm not gonna, I won't take credit for being the person that brought Agile into the organization. That was a team of people, right? And so I kind of came on right as they were really starting to do it. And so I got to come on right when we were really, really, really bad at it. I mean, there were times where we do two user, we'd try to do some poker for 2 user stories, or for planning poker for our user stories, and we'd get through 2 in the entire hour because we would get stuck on developers arguing about the acceptance criteria and which systems and all the implementation deals and everything like that. And, that's, now we can do 100 stories in an hour. It's just because we figured out how to boil it down and focus on the things that really matter.
And when was that? How long it took from the very beginning of starting creating Agile system to now where you're very efficient and you know how many you can handle and kind of like the process gets smooth?
I don't know if there's any kind of defining milestone or achievement when that actually happens, when you feel like, oh yeah, we finally got it. I think when you start to, I think when you start to really, when the meetings and the principles of Agile really start to become ingrained in you start, like their muscle memory, then you'll start to, call on those things like, well, hey, the story just came in. Well, how big is it? How many points is it? Right? Have the customer signed off on it? What did do we understand it? I mean, what's the priority of it? Right? And you start, the more you do it, the more you think that way. And the more you think that way, the more the muscle memory changes. And then it becomes kind of second nature, but it takes a little while to get there. I can't say that there's any, 2 years after doing this, you're going to get it. It's persistence. So you got to be persistent with it because it does pay off.
Absolutely. And I think the trick here is you never get too comfortable that you're too good with Agile, because it's always new surprises, new challenges, new ways of thinking and doing things that you have to keep yourself agile, right?
You have to, yeah. It'll atrophy if you don't pay attention to it, right? And you don't want. I mean, it's a garden. It's a garden, right? More metaphors, and you got to water it. You got to keep that alive. And to do that, earlier you mentioned stakeholders, Vanya, and one of the things that we had done very early on, and this is one of the benefit of working in an organization where our stakeholders are internal. There are work partners that work literally down the hall from us when we're in the office. But when we first took our first product owner certification training, we hired Ken Rubin. And we hired we rented a conference room at a hotel that was connected to CNN Center. And we paid for not just us to take it, and that was the product development organization, but we also paid for our main stakeholders to take it. And so by having them take the product owner training with us when we're first getting exposed to it, really helped them understand the terminology and the whys behind why we need to do this and that and these other things. And so they came into the process, and we included them very transparently very early on in the process. So they over time, we all just got better at it.
That's a very big point to emphasize on, like include in the actual training the leadership too, because most of the time what I face in my practice is that only managers or people that they will be either Scrum masters or they will be Agile coaches, they got the training and then they try to educate the leadership, and most of the time it's a mess because learning the process is not that easy. Is applying it is more difficult, of course, but to learn the details, to learn the terminology, to know what you're talking about, and to understand the depth and the potential, you have to take the training as a whole. You cannot do that only from one conversation.
No, you can't, right? And that's where I think a lot of organizations fail. And I'm glad you asked that, because when leadership doesn't understand that process adds value, and they have no expectation set, and all of a sudden there's just a new process that's being started, and anytime you make a big change like that, productivity goes down. And so if leadership isn't involved in that, all they're seeing is, hey, you started this new process and now your productivity's gone down. I don't like it, right? I want you to go back and do it the other way. But eventually, after that initial dip of productivity, then it's gonna take off, right? Once you get the handle on it, you start to get the rhythm with it. But this is why setting the expectations of leadership as early on as possible, that even have them go through training with it, have them understand that the process brings value, and they'll actually gain more value quicker if they actually let this thing cook. If they just let it go and let the teams do it and iterate through it and iterate through it and iterate through it until they get to some kind of measured stability.
Can you share with us what were the early expectations that you guys set?
Oh, so we've been doing this about 12 years ago. So you're asking me to think back 10 years. Actually, that's we still do that. I think expectation setting is one of the most important things that can be done in any kind of product development organization. I think it's one of the most important skill sets that you need to have. And Vanya, can you repeat your question?
So what were your expectations of success, like that you set?
When we first got, so thank you for rephrasing. When we first got into it, we didn't really have many expectations. And I think that's kind of important at the beginning, is you sort of set the expectation that you don't have many expectations at the beginning. I think that you can stick to early on, you can stick to, okay, we're going to have a 2-week sprint. So you can set the expectation that in 2 weeks, we're going to show you some kind of value, right? And then, you stick to that at first, and then you start throwing in the other ceremonies and letting other people, especially leadership, get them to start coming and to the sprint reviews and perhaps workshops and things like that. As long as you just to set expectations, you include them in the process. And I think that can lend itself well quite a bit.
Yeah, and in our previous conversation, you mentioned like that you knew you had to be incremental, reactive, and flexible with the expectations and with whatever you set, but you also have to have a vision and where you're going and target. Let's transition to Q&A.